This is Keen On, the daily now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. It is our last show of the week, certainly on the Friday afternoon, on August the 4th, 2023. And last shows on the week of a Friday means that was the week with my old friend Keith Teare. It's August, so on the West Coast at least, we are barbecuing. We're sitting outside. But Keith has another kind of barbecuing on his mind this week. It's the bonfires of the unicorns, Keith. Are you barbecuing unicorns, or are they just on fire down in Palo Alto?
Well, I've got to give credit to Kate Clark from The Information for the concept. She wrote an article this week saying there was a fire sale of unicorns. That was following on the footsteps of a company called Hopin, which is a British company that had achieved a valuation of $7.5 billion during the COVID period, was sold in parts for a song this week, and investors lost a lot of money. So she focused on that, added in a couple of other companies that had run out of money and were doing fire sales, and basically talked about what we've talked about a little bit on the show already, which is that the system as it has been the last 3 years is blocked, and to be unblocked, it is going to create a lot of ugliness, and the ugliness has begun. Hence, bonfire of the unicorns.
Is it uglier than your AI art, Keith?
Yeah, it's not the best mid-journey. I told it to put a unicorn in a city park with fire coming from the ground, and it wasn't very good. So then I said, well, try and make it 100 unicorns. So then it did that. And that's because there are probably
unicorns all fleeing from the fire. I mean, I know it's easy in retrospect, this stuff, and I'm not sure if I predicted it exactly, but wasn't it kind of obvious with companies like Hopin, as you said? It was a virtual events company during COVID, worth $7.5 billion. Keith, in your excellent editorial this week, you refer to Clark comparing Hopin to Clubhouse. I mean, I'm not sure about Hopin, but we certainly were very skeptical of Clubhouse. This stuff is so obvious, and yet people continue to lose ridiculous amounts of money on it. Why and how?
Well, I think it's the dilemma of innovation is exciting. So Clubhouse, when it first came along, did do something new, which was real-time audience participation audio, a little bit like with phone-in shows on the radio.
Yes, so it wasn't very different.
It wasn't very different, but it's the first time you could do it digitally. And initially, at least, a lot of people did it. And the same with Hopin. Hopin was, okay, well, you can't go to a conference because of COVID, but we can do an online version of a conference. And it was a little bit better than, what you could do on Zoom, for example. And so the innovation was real. What wasn't real was the valuations, because what happens with innovation is money flocks to the winner in a category before the category is proven to be real. And that, in some ways, is a very human thing. I don't think you could ever stop it. And so the valuations got driven up very fast, super fast in the case of Hopin. And I, in the editorial, I put a table showing the dates and when they raised money and what the valuation was. And I've been through it myself with real names. I raised 3 rounds of financing in 1 year. The year was 1998. And we went from raising 5 million to raising 70 million per round because investors wanted to invest. And it's almost impossible to say no when that happens to you, because you want to build a big company. So the valuation goes up, and then a bubble bursts and the valuation isn't real anymore.
So coming back to Hopin, or Hopin, or whatever it's called, I mean, there is a market for virtual events. There was before COVID. There certainly was one during COVID, and there is one now. Why couldn't the people at Hopin have negotiated that, understood that, and built themselves to, I mean, in an odd way, it's not surviving the drought, it's surviving the cornucopia, it's surviving the free money.
Well, if you really get into the weeds, what Hopin did wrong, and a lot of companies do wrong, is just because you raise a lot of money doesn't mean you need to spend it. So if you have a balanced view of your opportunity over, let's say, 10 years, raising a lot of money doesn't need to be a problem. But it is a problem if you spend it and need to raise more. Because once the valuation era has shifted to a more reasonable valuation era, and the new valuation of Hopin, by the way, where they retain a company called StreamYard that they acquired, that's not unlike the software we're using now on our show, is 400 million. So from 7.5 billion to 400 million. And I think they sold assets to Ring Central for about 400 million as well. So let's say 800 million. So it's 10% of its former value. That wouldn't be a problem if they'd preserved capital, they had a big bank account, and they could afford to take time to grow into a valuation. But because they spent the money super fast, believing that more would come, then they're stuffed because no one's going to invest on top of a $7.5 billion valuation.
Oh, well, but the investors, if they kept all the investment money, the investors will say, why are you keeping our money? The whole point of putting it in was for you to get grab market share or control the market or do this or that.
Yeah, but when you raise $1 billion, you can probably do that with 200 million and keep 800 million in the bank. You don't have to spend $1 billion.
How do you short these markets, Keith? If you saw this stuff going on, and maybe now it's happening with AI, it certainly happened a couple of years ago with crypto, and with these other virtual online platforms during COVID. I mean, even PayPal, which is a credible company, I mean, its stock is 60, and COVID times it was up to 300. How do you short that? How can a private investor short it?
Well, the way that it works in private markets is people who have the inclination to short become secondary buyers after the problems have developed. So like this week, I didn't put it in the newsletter, but last week we talked about Michael Moritz leaving Sequoia. Well, this week it was announced that he's teamed up with some other people through Sequoia Heritage to create a fund for buying distressed assets. So the secondary buyers basically become people who pick up distressed assets that still have life in them once the valuations.
Yeah, but Moritz has a lot of money. He knows what he's doing. But for ordinary people, for myself, if I saw this ridiculous explosion of tech investments in an area which I was convinced was bound to fail, then how can you bet against it?
The only way to bet against it is to bet in public markets against stocks that mirror the ecosystem, like the ARK Invest fund that Kathy Woods runs.
Right.
Invest in a lot of unicorns.
Isn't this a startup idea, Keith? Couldn't you do something like this? You've always wanted to, you always talked about democratizing the market. So you've always wanted ordinary investors, retail investors to be able to have access to startups. Why shouldn't they also have access to betting against startups?
I don't have the DNA for that, Andrew.
I'm not saying you do, but somebody else.
So yeah, well, that it already is there, really. There are various hedge funds that you can invest in. You have to be an accredited investor, but there's various hedge funds that specialize in shorting, and they short public markets because you can't short private markets. And then there's others which are what you might think of as bottom feeders. So Dave McClure, who used to be the founder of 500 Startups, now has a fund that buys assets from LPs in funds, where the assets have been devalued, and he buys them for pennies on the dollar. So there is a whole ecosystem around that, and you can invest in Dave McClure's fund.
So in terms of the funds, another thing you mentioned in the editorial this week is that Union Square Ventures one of the smartest and most successful venture funds, has marked down its assets by 26%. How well are leading venture capital firms dealing with this?
They're mostly delaying the inevitable. So Union Square actually got a bit of flack for doing this.
Why?
It's considered too much of a write down by some people. In fact, the opposite is probably true. It's probably too little. But the fact they did it at all is a leading indicator of what's likely to come. Again, hence the Bonfire of the Unicorns title. We're beginning to see reevaluations of the asset value of portfolios. And I think that's a process. It's going to take a year or so because audits have to happen. And when audits happen, you're going to have to justify the valuation you're holding an asset at on your books, and you won't be able to. And I would say 50 to 60% write-downs are going to be more normal than 26% write-downs when that happens.
What does that actually mean? So if a USV marks down by 50 to 60%, it's not going to jeopardize its business. It's just jeopardizing that particular fund.
It's the fund. So let's say you invested $100 million in 10 companies, and none of those companies have done the next round yet. And meanwhile, the market has shifted in terms of valuation norms. That 100 million, which is your investors' money that you've put to work, may now be only worth 40 million. So you've turned 100 million into 40 million.
That's quite an achievement, right?
Right. And you have to report on that. And then it takes a long time to get it back, if you ever do.
Another piece that you highlight this week is Sequoia cuts its crypto fund by 66%. That's not actually cutting the valuation, it's the actual fund, right?
Yes, Sequoia has this structure, which we've discussed before on the show, which there's a top level pool of money, and they're allowed to allocate from that pool into various initiatives, one of which is crypto. So this is them deciding to allocate less of their money to crypto in the aftermath of the FTX fiasco. And the two of the partners running the crypto fund left. We talked about that last week. So they're basically...
Was that a euphemism for being fired, do you think, given all their missteps?
I think in venture, you don't really get fired because you have some economics in the fund, but you don't... It's close.
You're not invited back. You're not...
Yeah, exactly.
And one of the consequences is you haven't put this piece in because I think I must have forgotten to send you the link, but I think it's a really interesting piece in the FT this week by Ruchir Sharma suggesting that the title is "What's Wrong with Tech Giants Riding the AI Wave?" The AI wave, not wive. And the premise is that because of this collapse or certainly crisis of early stage funding, all the innovation now is coming from big companies, and the big company news, as you know, is actually pretty good. Meta's numbers weren't bad. Their stock is strong. The same with Alphabet. What do you think this is all going to mean when all the innovation comes from Meta and Facebook and even OpenAI, which is one of the few successful AI startups, is essentially funded by Microsoft?
Yeah. Well, firstly, it's accurate to say that that's what's happening. The costs of entry into AI are so high, especially the large language models that are dominating today, that unless you're a big company with a big bank account, you can't even begin to do it. OpenAI was underwritten by Microsoft, which is why they could do it. And Microsoft obviously has an ownership stake in OpenAI. There are very few others in the same league. I mean, there's 4 or 5 other large AI investments that have happened, but probably the biggest signal to how that might change is there's a company got funded this week called Together.ai, and Together.ai just did a seed round, so you heard it here first, and it's a platform for third parties to be able to carry out the kinds of training that the big companies can do. And it's all open source. It's a pay-as-you-go service, so it's not free. But it does indicate that there may be a democratization of AI capability coming bottoms up through the equivalent of SaaS companies in the AI space. So I'd say Together.ai is one to keep an eye on.
And then another headline is broadly venture capital investments down 54%. And I assume all that investment is going into AI, into companies like Together.
Not all of it, but a lot. But it tends to be going in large checks into a small number of companies. There are thousands of AI startups, literally thousands.
I would think there's tens of thousands, actually. I mean, anyone who's doing a tech startup is by definition an AI startup, isn't it?
Not all of them. No, there's a lot of deep science startups right now.
We're going to get to deep science later in the show with your startup of the week. One of your headlines, which is interesting, which wasn't surprising again, is that you think, or one of the articles believes that AI will have the biggest impact in healthcare. That's a no-brainer, and I assume that a lot of the money is going there.
A lot of money will go there. So far, not as much as is going to. That's an Andreessen Horowitz article, and so they're selling their own book in a way when they say that. But obviously, human anatomy at the deep level is beginning to be understood, and there's no reason to believe AI won't accelerate that understanding. We already know that DeepMind, for example, was able to model all the proteins in the human body, which scientists hadn't been able to do.
And from the retail point of view, it's a no-brainer. I mean, I've had lots of keen-on shows about how doctors and nurses will be able to scale themselves in terms of dealing with medical issues, which currently are not very well dealt with on the retail front in terms of patients and doctors.
Yeah. The real breakthrough comes when robotics meets AI, which it isn't yet. But we already have keyhole surgery. And we already have keyhole surgery where a surgeon can control a machine at a very high level of accuracy, down to millimeters in the body. So robotics is going to be better at that than a human once the procedures are understood enough to replicate. So I think you do end up in this robotics meets software meets human need. But the most exciting stuff, I think, is stuff I don't really understand. I'm not enough of a biologist to understand it.
I thought you answered everything, Keith.
Yeah, I definitely don't understand DNA, and I don't understand stem cells, and I don't understand, creating viruses that attack cancer cells.
Right. Yeah.
But all of that human engineering is going to accelerate massively.
And in terms of the broader impact of AI, as these big companies, the Metas, the Nvidias, the Alphabets, the Amazons, the Apples of the world control the platform, will it mean that there'll be opportunities for startup entrepreneurs in the verticals like healthcare or insurance or finance or entertainment?
Yeah, the word I would use to describe all of that is unbundling. It's a cyclical thing in tech. The first thing that happens is some mega breakthrough happens. Large language models is a good example. But if you go way back in time, the internet itself and the idea of a portal there was one portal. It was called Yahoo, and then there was two, Netscape, and then there were three, Excite and InfoSeek and others, and then there was Google and Alta Vista.
And before that, it was AOL.
Before that, AOL. Now, if you roll the clock forward, what happened? Today, we have specialist sites for very specific interests. You go to YouTube. We don't have a video site anymore. We have millions of video sites, each one dedicated to niche subjects. So unbundling is the process of technology being applied more and more specifically to human needs or wants. And I think with AI, you're going to see that in every domain. Anything that humans demand, someone will build AI to supply the demand. And that's unbundling. So the big opportunities for startups is to pick a space, let's say real estate sales, homes. What will be the AI impact on Redfin or Zillow? Somebody's going to build something that's way better at valuation, at selection, at access to purchases, and it's going to revolutionize something that already exists by making it better. That's unbundling, and I think that is inevitable.
Is that what one of your articles this week describes as historic futurism? By Kyle Harrison, subtitled "Using Science Fiction to Invent the Future." Can we learn about what will happen from the past? Is it almost inevitable, Keith, with your Marxist background?
Yeah.
Is this a kind of historical determinism working itself out?
Well, there's no inevitability in history, that's for sure. So in that sense, the historical determinists are wrong. But technology does open up the possibility for human investigation and decision to focus on something. And historical futurism, it's my first, I can't remember if I made it the first essay, but it's one of my...
Yeah, I think it's the first essay.
It's really good. And what it really says is that you can choose the future you want based on the available tools in the present. You can already imagine and create what comes next. So that to me is true. I've always believed that the entrepreneur really is a believer in something that doesn't exist but can. The science fiction is the believer in something that doesn't exist and can't. So the difference between science fiction and entrepreneurialism is whether it can exist. Uber didn't exist, but it already could. And Travis Kalanick figured that out. Same with Airbnb. It didn't exist, but it could. And so historical futurism is reminding yourself that the present is only a canvas. And it's your job to pick the tools from the present to create something that doesn't exist, but can. And if it exists, people want.
Yeah, you got to be audacious. I mean, at the time when Airbnb and Uber launched, they both seemed entirely absurd, and now they seem completely natural. Your broadcast of the week is from the great Teare, your better half, Keith. What's Janae been talking about? Assessing venture capital. I assume that all your wisdom about this collapse of VC is taken from Janae, because she's at Crunchbase and she's smarter than you anyway.
Yeah. Well, I think Kate Clark also gets a call out, but this podcast was done by Standard & Poor's. We all have heard of the S&P 500, that's Standard & Poor's. And they asked her to talk about what's going on in venture capital. And she does a great job. It's had a lot of plaudits on X, formerly known as Twitter. And she pointed it out to me only this morning, by the way. So I included it at the last minute. And confession, I actually haven't listened to it.
Oh my God. Did you tell Janae that?
Well, she knows because she only just told me about it.
Well, you'll have to do that this afternoon. A couple of other pieces of news before we get to our startup of the week. Interesting piece on VW investing in China, 5% in XPeng. Has the China crisis passed? I mean, the headlines in the New York Times today are Biden and the Chinese are talking to one another again. Have we got over that hysteria that was earlier this summer about TikTok and the Chinese and all the rest of it?
It's quietened down quite a bit, hasn't it? And diplomacy,
which is good.
Yeah, and diplomacy suggests that's the trend. It did. The Economist announced this week that China is now the world's largest exporter of cars, which it wasn't up until now. But in the same copy of The Economist, they also wrote that it's going to take at least 2 more decades before China is the largest economy in the world, eclipsing the US. So there's balance and nuance there. Volkswagen taking a 5% stake, there's a couple of parts to that. The first is the Chinese electric vehicle industry is super innovative, and the cars are very high-end luxury cars. The Chinese buyers demand luxury, so they don't buy Teslas that much because the internal of a Tesla is too Spartan for them. So VW is doing.
Well, I would, as a Tesla owner, in fact, we're a 2 Tesla family. I would describe it as minimalist rather than Spartan.
It's minimalist, and a Chinese buyer wants soft, comfy chairs, and they want luxury. The biggest English word used in China is VIP, and so there's this kind of desire for higher end, and so that was always a challenge to Tesla. One of my friends is Veronica Wu. She used to run Tesla in China, and she used to tell me that her hardest job was selling to high net worth individuals there because they wanted something that was more like a Mercedes or an Audi or a BMW level of luxury. And the fact that Tesla was so far ahead technologically in EVs wasn't enough. Well, now XPeng and NIO and Li and BYD, there's 4 huge ones in China, are all super competitive, and VW wants a piece of the Chinese market. It also wants to take technology from China into the VW and Audi franchise. They're the same company outside of China. So I think,
I mean, that's doubly good news. Good news on any investments, real investments in EVs, plus the global network is a good thing, and the pushback against economic nationalism or autarky, finally, or finally, our startup of the week, Keith. I have to admit, not only have I not heard of this company, I didn't even understand what this industry is. What is LK99, the DIY race to replicate LK99?
So LK99 is a code word for a South Korean effort to create what's known as a superconductor that can operate in normal temperatures.
Yeah, as if it was room temperature.
So what is a superconductor? When electricity runs through wires, there's friction. Copper is usually the chosen wire to run through. Silver is a better conductor than copper, but copper is cheap enough to use. But it creates friction, which is why you get heat in systems that use copper, because friction creates heat. A superconductor is something that allows electricity to pass with no friction, literally zero friction. So there's no heat and no loss. And it's been, and by the way, it can pass through the air. It doesn't need a wire. It can pass through thin air. So electricity can be moved around in space. And this has been something everyone's been chasing for a long, long time. I remember there was a TechCrunch Disrupt company that claimed to have done it, and then it turned out they hadn't. So last week, 2 papers were published by this South Korean PhDs saying they'd figured it out. And I think it was 2 or 3 weeks ago. And now everyone's gotten very preoccupied with, firstly, doubting whether they really did do it. But if they did it, trying to replicate it. They published the papers so anyone can replicate it. If it's real, it means things like nuclear fusion and close to free power becomes possible, and much cheaper, smaller components become possible, like transistors give off heat. If superconducting was real, it's as profound as the transistor in terms of revolutionizing electricity and what it can be put to work doing.
So is this a start? I mean, you call it a startup of the week. This is hardcore science. This is not a startup.
It's hardcore science, and it's still contested. It isn't yet science.
Yeah, I think this, Keith, this is an August choice. This isn't. I don't think we're going to allow it. It's
Well-
not a startup. What is this? What's a startup? A startup
Well-
requires a couple of people in a garage to think something up. This is a serious scientific endeavor.
Yeah, but it is just a few people in a garage that did it.
Well, maybe then we'll allow it, but even if it's a garage in Korea. I don't know if they have. Do they have garages in Korea?
Of course they do. They have electric cars.
They got everything. They got it in Korea: bathrooms, toilets.
It's amazing how
Cars,
advanced Korea is.
Well done, Korea. You're the startup of the week. Finally, and this is a very personal choice, Keith. Tweet of the week from John Collison at Collision at Stripe, co-founder of Stripe, announced that Stefan Tomlinson was going to join Stripe as its chief financial officer. By the way, you should change the name from Tweet of the Week to X of the Week. I mean, tweet is an old-fashioned word now.
You're right. You actually said that last week, and I agreed with you, and I forgot to do it again.
Yeah. Well, anyway, what's the big deal about this? It's just another executive joining another overvalued startup.
Well, there's two dimensions to this. One is I know Stefan. He's a family friend. Our kids were in school in the same era, so we've known him for a long time. But so that would already want me to put it there, but that actually isn't the reason I put it there. The reason I put it there is Stefan is a bit of a specialist. If you look at his LinkedIn, you'll see he has a history of joining companies just before they.
Whoa.
He joined Palo Alto Networks, where another friend of mine, Mark McLaughlin, was the CEO, and that company went public and did very well. And he's done it a few times. So I would speculate, and I don't know this because I haven't spoken to Stefan, that Stripe is very close, 12 to 18 months away from an IPO. And Stefan's job is to get them ready to do that, because that's what he does.
Is Stripe about as blue chip as, I don't know if you'd call it a late stage startup as it's possible to be?
It is, yeah. It's very late stage. It's almost as late as Uber was when it went public, or Facebook for that matter.
And could it trigger some sort of new startup IPO market?
Well, it'll be an attractive company to invest in anyway, as long as its valuation, aligns with current valuation models. The mistake that most IPOs make is they overvalue, some of them undervalue. You just got to get it right, which is why Stefan is there. That's probably one of his jobs, to get the valuation right, working with people like Morgan Stanley or Goldman Sachs or whoever it is they end up working with. And I think Stripe could go public tomorrow if it was ready, as long as the valuation is okay, because it's a high quality company. By the time it does go public, the markets will have evolved from where they are today, and multiples of revenue that you can price your stock at may be better. That's possible, but I don't think that'll be a key thought. Most CEOs, when you go public, I've done it a couple of times, you don't really focus on the share price. You focus on raising money to execute the next phase of your company. That's really all you're doing.
Have you got any barbecues coming up, Keith? Are you going to be barbecuing any unicorns this week in Palo Alto?
I think they might not be very tasty. So the answer is I'll stick to the beef.
Well, we will be back, beef or unicorns or otherwise, next week. I think we're going to broadcast on Thursday because I'm going to New York on Friday. Keith, have a great week. And be careful with your unicorns, everyone. They're a dying breed.